The air in the command tent at Forward Operating Base Ares was a tangible entity, thick with the smells of ozone from overworked servers, stale coffee, and the fine, pervasive dust of the Kandahar province, a powder so ancient it seemed to carry the memory of forgotten empires. It was an atmosphere of manufactured urgency, a constant low-grade hum of generators and human anxiety that vibrated up through the soles of combat boots. This hum was the base's heartbeat, a rhythm of precarious existence against a backdrop of hostile silence. At the center of this world, a world defined by rigid hierarchy and explicit power, stood Lieutenant Commander Thorne. He was not merely in the room, he occupied it, his presence expanding like a gas to fill every corner, his voice a percussive instrument against the tense canvas walls. Thorne was a man carved from the template of institutional ambition. He was tall, with a jaw that seemed engineered for confident pronouncements, and a chest puffed with the self-regard that came from a career spent mastering the performance of authority rather than its substance. His uniform was immaculate, the creases sharp enough to cut, his insignia polished to a belligerent gleam. He was holding court, his audience a semicircle of junior officers and senior enlisted personnel, all positioned in varying orbits of deference around his gravitational pull. He gestured with a laser pointer at a digital map, his voice booming with the unearned certainty of a man who had never once been proven wrong, mostly because he had never once ventured into a situation where true failure was a possibility. "The principle is simple, gentlemen," he declared, the word gentleman, a casual dismissal of the few women present. "Force projection. We don't wait for the threat. We project power so aggressively, so overwhelmingly, that the threat never considers forming. We are the roaring bonfire on the hilltop, a warning to everything that lurks in the shadows. We burn so bright that the darkness itself recedes." He paused, letting his metaphor settle, pleased with its simple, powerful imagery. His followers nodded, their expressions a mixture of admiration and dutiful agreement. They saw a leader, a titan, a bulwark against the chaos outside the wire. They saw the bonfire, and in the periphery, almost perfectly camouflaged against a stack of sterile medical supply crates, they saw nothing. Or rather, they saw what their minds were conditioned to dismiss, a pocket of silence, a human-shaped void in the loud masculine energy of the room. This was Specialist Vance. She was not on any official command roster that Thorne had bothered to read. Her transfer paperwork had listed her under a vague operational support designation attached to the medical unit. She wore sterile gray fatigues with no name, no rank, no insignia of any kind. Her build was slight, unassuming, and she possessed a stillness that was deeply unsettling to men like Thorne. It was not the stillness of fear or deference, but the absolute economical calm of a precision instrument at rest. Her eyes, the color of a winter sky, scanned the room, not with curiosity, but with a flat, analytical regard. She was not observing a briefing, she was processing data. The heat shimmer off the servers, the subtle sag in the tense tension cables, the faint tremor in a young lieutenant's hand as he held his data pad. It was all input. Thorne's gaze swept the room, basking in the attention, and snagged on her. His flow, the rhythm of his performance, was disrupted by her absolute non-participation. She did not nod. She did not lean forward with interest. She simply existed, a shard of obsidian in his carefully constructed bonfire. He saw a rookie, a medic or a nurse, probably fresh from training, sent out to this god-forsaken dust bowl to fill a slot. He saw weakness. He saw a loose thread in the tight fabric of his authority, and his ego, a fragile and ravenous thing, demanded it be pulled. "And of course," he said, his voice dripping with condescension as he turned his full attention, and therefore the attention of the entire room, upon her. "We must also be mindful of our support elements. Even the quietest little mouse has a role to play." He smiled, a predator's baring of teeth. "Tell me, Specialist, is it Vance? Are you keeping up? Or is all this talk of force projection a bit too noisy for the medical bay?" The junior officers chuckled, a sycophantic chorus. They were taking their cue from their leader. The quiet woman was the target, the acceptable object of ridicule. Vance's expression did not change. Her gaze met his, and for a half-second, Thorne felt a strange, unpleasant sensation, a feeling akin to being scanned by a piece of diagnostic equipment that had found a deep, irreparable flaw. But the feeling passed, dismissed by his own arrogance. She didn't reply with a witty retort or a flustered defense. She didn't speak at all. She simply gave a single, slow, deliberate blink. It was an act of such minimal energy, yet it felt like the closing of a blast door. It was a statement. You are not relevant. Your question is not data. You are noise. The dismissal was so profound, so utterly complete, that Thorne was left momentarily speechless. He had expected fear, or at least a stammered attempt to placate him. He received nothing. He was a force of nature, a storm, and she was a stone that the wind simply flowed around. To the others in the room, it looked like she had frozen, intimidated into silence. They saw a mouse, just as he had described. But Master Chief Sullivan, sitting quietly in the back corner by the comms console, saw something else. He was a man who had spent 30 years in the silent, lethal world of naval intelligence. He knew the difference between the silence of fear and the silence of patience. He had seen predators wait, utterly still, for the precise moment to strike. He watched Vance, and he saw a hunter. Thorne, flustered, turned back to his map, his voice a little too loud, a little too forceful, to cover the fissure she had opened in his performance. "As I was saying," he boomed, "dominance is the key." But the word now sounded hollow, a desperate claim rather than an established fact. The quiet woman in the corner had not said a word, but she had fundamentally altered the dynamics of the room. She had presented a different model of power, one that did not need to announce itself. It was a law of physics he did not understand, the immense crushing power of a vacuum. And in that moment, the seeds of his undoing were sown not in an act of aggression, but in a single, silent blink. Over the next few weeks, the FOB settled into its tense rhythm, and Thorne's misinterpretation of Vance solidified into a kind of institutional dogma. He made it a point to belittle her, always in public, always with a theatrical flair. He referred to her as our resident wallflower, or the rookie nurse. He would interrupt her as she conducted quiet inventory of medical supplies, demanding to know if the bandages were tucked in tightly enough for inspection. Each jab was designed to provoke a reaction, to force her out of her stillness and into the emotional arena where he was the master. He needed her to cry or to argue or to complain to a superior, any of which would have validated his assessment of her as a weak, emotional female out of her depth. But Vance never gave him the satisfaction. Her response to his provocations was always the same, a profound and unnerving lack of response. She treated his words as one might treat the buzzing of a fly, an ambient annoyance to be filtered out, unworthy of engagement. She would meet his mocking gaze with her clinical, analytical stare, hold it for precisely 1.5 seconds, and then return to her task, whether it was calibrating a defibrillator or field stripping a sidearm with the detached efficiency of a watchmaker. This, more than any defiance, enraged Thorne. He was shouting into a soundproof room, his power dissipating without effect. The young corpsman, Petty Officer Davies, watched this silent war with a growing sense of confusion. He worked alongside Vance in the small, sterile world of the clinic. He saw what Thorne did not. He saw the way she organized the trauma kits, not by regulation, but by a brutal logic of probability. Tourniquets, chest seals, and clotting agents were packed in a sequence that anticipated the kinetic violence of an IED blast, a system designed to shave precious seconds off a medic's response time under fire. He saw her spend her off-duty hours not in the mess hall, but in the motor pool, studying the schematics of their armored vehicles, her fingers tracing the lines of hydraulic systems and electrical conduits. Once, he found her in the comms tent, having a quiet technical conversation with Master Chief Sullivan about signal propagation and encryption algorithms. "She's not a nurse, is she?" Davies asked the Master Chief one evening after Vance had left. Sullivan looked up from a schematic of a satellite uplink, his eyes crinkling at the corners. He took a long sip of his bitter coffee. "Son," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, "you're looking at a Bugatti and calling it a bicycle because it's parked in the bike rack. Some people, are systems unto themselves. They don't fit in the neat little boxes this man's army likes to build. Commander Thorne sees the box. He can't see what's inside. Thorne's bonfire continued to roar. He led loud, ostentatious patrols just outside the wire, returning with triumphant declarations of area denial. He held daily briefings that were less about disseminating information and more about reinforcing his own narrative of command. He was the hero of a story he was writing in real time, and he was its only important character. Vance remained at the margins, a ghost in the machine, her quiet competence a constant, unspoken rebuke to his performative authority. She was a check engine light that Thorne had decided to fix by putting a piece of black tape over it. The system, however, was still failing. The crisis did not arrive like a thunderclap. It came like a virus, silent and insidious. It began not with an explosion, but with a flicker. The lights in the command tent wavered for a moment, the hum of the servers dipping in pitch before catching again. On the main tactical display, a single pixel in the far corner of the map glitched, turning a vibrant, unnatural green before correcting itself. Thorne, in the middle of a self-congratulatory monologue about a recent patrol, didn't notice. Davies, restocking supplies in the clinic, felt a subtle vibration through the concrete floor, a shudder that was out of sync with the generator's familiar rhythm. Master Chief Sullivan, his eyes narrowed at his console, saw it. He saw the ghost in the machine. A microsecond of anomalous data, a whisper of code where there should have been silence. Vance was cleaning a surgical tray, her movements economical and precise. She paused, her head tilting almost imperceptibly. Her focus was not on the tool in her hand, but on the air itself. She felt it before anyone else truly understood it. The change in the quality of the silence outside, the subtle shift in the generator's frequency, the faint scent of ozone that was sharper, more acrid than usual. To her, the base was a single complex organism, a system of interconnected systems, and she could feel the first faint tremors of a catastrophic systems failure. She placed the tool down, her movements still unhurried, but now imbued with a terrible and absolute purpose. The quiet was over. Then came the noise. It was a sound unlike the familiar crump of mortars or the crackle of small arms fire. It was a deep, resonant thump that seemed to come from the ground itself, followed by a high-pitched electronic squeal that pierced the ears. Every light in the FOB went out simultaneously. The roar of air conditioners, the hum of servers, the chatter of radios, all of it vanished, replaced by a sudden suffocating silence. It was the silence of a dead machine. The base's heartbeat had stopped. Darkness and confusion reigned. Shouts erupted in the command tent. Thorne's voice, for the first time, held a note of genuine surprise, quickly masked by bluster. "Report! What the hell was that? Get the backup generators online, now!" He bellowed into the blackness, but his commands were swallowed by the void. There was no one to report. The comms were dead. The screens were blank. His authority, derived from the systems now offline, had evaporated. He was just a loud man shouting in a dark room. In that first moment of chaos, while men fumbled for flashlights and their training screamed conflicting protocols, Vance moved. She was not a person, she was a process, a diagnostic sequence executing. She flowed through the darkened clinic, her hands finding everything she needed by memory, by the cold map of logic she had built in her mind. A headlamp, a compact diagnostic toolkit, a data slate with its own hardened power source. Her movements were a fluid ballet of efficiency, devoid of panic or hesitation. Davies, fumbling with his own light, could only watch, mesmerized. She was a predator in her natural environment, and the darkness was her ally. The second sound was more conventional and far more terrifying. The sharp, unmistakable chatter of automatic weapons fire erupting from the north perimeter. It was close, too close. Then, from the south, another burst. They were being probed, tested, or worse, systematically dismantled. The attack was coordinated. The electronic warfare had been the opening salvo, the scalpel to sever the base's nervous system. The kinetic attack was the follow-through, designed to exploit the resulting paralysis. In the command tent, chaos had found a voice, and it was Thorne's. "Status on the perimeter. Someone get me a damn radio that works. Where's my fire support?" He was a drowning man grasping at procedures that no longer existed. He tried to raise the motor pool, the guard towers, headquarters, anyone. His world had been reduced to the 10-meter radius of his own shouting. His bonfire had been extinguished, leaving only smoke and impotent rage. Vance was already outside, moving through the developing pandemonium. She wasn't running. Her pace was a controlled, ground-eating stride that conserved energy. She moved like water, finding the path of least resistance through clusters of panicked soldiers. Her headlamp cut a narrow, disciplined beam through the darkness, sweeping, assessing. Her mind was a cold engine of calculation. Threat vector north, 7.62 millimeters, cyclic rate consistent with PKM. Threat vector south, 5.45 millimeters, AK-74 variant, coordinated. Objective, divide response, create crossfire. Primary threat, system decapitation. Secondary threat, perimeter breach. My objective, restore nervous system. She arrived at the main power distribution hub, a small, fortified bunker near the center of the base. The air was thick with the smell of burnt electronics. The EMP-like blast had fried the primary and secondary control boards. A young engineer officer was there, staring at the smoking panels with wide, terrified eyes. "It's all gone," he stammered. "The circuits are melted. We're blind. It'll take days to rewire this." Vance did not respond to his despair. It was useless data. She pushed past him, her light playing over the wreckage. Her hands moved with surgical precision, pulling a diagnostic probe from her kit. She wasn't looking at the catastrophic damage. She was searching for the single unbroken thread. She bypassed the main breakers, her tools moving faster than the eye could follow. She found it, a tertiary maintenance line, shielded and isolated, meant for diagnostics, not for carrying a full base load. It was designed to handle a fraction of the required power. It was not a solution, but it was a beginning. "I need a 4-core shielded cable, 50 meters, and the battery array from Vehicle 7, the command Humvee." "Now," she said. Her voice was flat, calm, the first coherent, actionable command anyone had heard since the lights went out. The young officer, startled by her certainty, simply stared. Vance turned her head, and her eyes, illuminated from below by the light of her data slate, were chips of ice. "Move!" He moved. While he and Davies scrambled to follow her orders, she worked on the comms hub. The scene inside was a mirror of the power bunker. Master Chief Sullivan was wrestling with his equipment, but it was a losing battle. The delicate high-frequency receivers were fried. "They didn't just jam us," he growled, sweat beading on his forehead. "They cooked us. Everything is slag." "Not everything," Vance stated, not as a question, but as a fact. She pointed to a dusty, antiquated piece of equipment in the corner, a relic from a previous decade. A high-frequency burst transmitter, analog, powered by its own crank generator. It was slow, insecure, and line of sight, a museum piece. "Give me line of sight to the relay drone." Sullivan looked from the dead multi-million-dollar satellite rig to the analog relic, then to Vance. A slow smile spread across his face. "You beautiful, primitive bastard," he whispered, and began to help her haul the heavy machine towards the roof. Meanwhile, Thorne had finally found a working field radio, a short-range tactical unit. He had rallied a small group of security personnel and was trying to organize a counterattack. But he was fighting the last war. He was barking orders based on the last known position of the enemy from before the system went down. "Alpha Team, advance on grid coordinate 479er, lay down suppressing fire," he yelled into the handset. His voice was a beacon of confidence, but his orders were ghosts. The enemy wasn't at 479er. They had used the blackout to move, to reposition. Thorne was ordering his men to shoot at shadows. On the roof of the comms building, Vance and Sullivan worked in grim, silent synchronicity. They cranked the generator, the machine emitting a low, mournful whine. Vance tapped out a string of code on a small attached keypad, a compressed data packet containing a raw diagnostic of the base's status and a request for a hard system reboot from the orbiting drone. It was a message in a bottle, hurled into an electronic ocean. For a long minute, there was nothing. Then, a single green light on the ancient transmitter blinked once. Acknowledged. Simultaneously, in the power bunker, Davies and the engineer officer connected the massive batteries from the Humvee to the maintenance line Vance had identified. Following her precise hand-drawn schematic on her data slate, they created a bypass, a desperate piece of field engineering. The lights in the clinic and the command tent flickered back to life. Not the full bright glare of before, but a dim, anemic glow. It was enough. The tactical display in the command tent lit up, but it was not the map Thorne knew. It was a new interface, stark and minimalist. A single line of text pulsed at the bottom of the screen, displayed in a simple block font. System reboot initiated. C&C slave to Medbay terminal, awaiting instructions. Thorne stared at the screen, his mind unable to process the words. Medbay terminal. It was nonsensical. Then, his radio crackled to life, no longer dead static, but a clear, calm voice. It was Vance. Her voice was stripped of all inflection, as clinical as the text on the screen. All call signs, this is Medbay. Cease current maneuvers. Stand by for new targeting data. Enemy is not at your front. They are on your flank. They used the blackout to infiltrate the western maintenance tunnel. Objective is the fuel depot. Acknowledge. There was a moment of stunned silence across the net. Who was this? What authority was this? Thorne grabbed the handset, his face purple with rage. This is Commander Thorne. Who the hell is this? I am in command here. I give the orders. All units disregard that last transmission. Continue the assault on 479er. The response was not from Vance. It was from Master Chief Sullivan, his voice like rocks grinding together. All call signs. This is Ares Actual. You will follow the instructions from Medbay. That is a direct order. Thorne, you are relieved of command. Shut up and stay off this net. The authority in his voice was absolute, forged over 30 years of quiet, lethal competence. It was the institutional wisdom recognizing and validating true skill in the heart of a crisis. The net went silent for a beat, and then, one by one, the call signs checked in, acknowledging the new command. Bravo, Roger. Charlie, solid copy. They had their orders. Thorne stood frozen, the radio handset limp in his hand. He had been excised, bypassed, made irrelevant. In the dim light of the command tent, surrounded by the technology that had abandoned him, he was no longer a roaring bonfire. He was just a man, cold and alone in the dark, listening to the calm, precise voice of the rookie nurse as she systematically dismantled the enemy attack, vector by vector, her commands like a surgeon's scalpel, cutting away the cancer that threatened to consume them. The battle for FOB Ares was over for him, but the reckoning was just beginning. The aftermath was a study in contrasts. The base, under Vance's cool, logical direction, had repelled the complex attack with an efficiency that was almost terrifying. The enemy force, expecting a panicked and disorganized response, had walked into a meticulously orchestrated trap. Vance, using the limited power and restored sensors to create a lethal web of interlocking fields of fire, had not just defended the base, she had annihilated the attackers. The fuel depot, their primary target, was untouched. Casualties on their side were minimal, and of those wounded, all survived, thanks to the impossible speed and precision of Vance's medical interventions performed in the brief lulls between her issuing fire control commands. As the sun rose, casting a pale, dusty light over the scene, the base was a hive of quiet, purposeful activity. Teams cleared the perimeter, medics tended to the wounded, and engineers, guided by Vance's schematics, began the arduous task of repairing the primary systems. At the center of it all, yet apart from it, was Vance. She was back in the clinic, cleaning her instruments, her gray fatigue stained with dirt, grease, and the blood of the men she had saved. She moved with the same unhurried, economical grace as before, the storm having passed through her and left no trace. To see her now, one would never guess that this small, quiet woman had been the central nervous system, the brain and the will of the entire base for 6 critical hours. Thorne was a ghost. He wandered the base, his authority stripped away, his presence ignored. The men who had once hung on his every word now looked through him, their attention focused on the tasks assigned by the disembodied voice that had saved them. He saw the way they looked at the clinic with a new kind of reverence and awe. He heard them talking in hushed tones, calling her Medbay, not as a location, but as a name, a title. The legend was already forming, and he was a footnote in it, a cautionary tale of hubris and failure. His rage had curdled into a sour, bitter resentment. He began to construct his own narrative, a fortress of lies to protect the fragile core of his ego. It was an equipment failure, a catastrophic, unforeseeable event. He had been hampered by faulty intelligence. The junior personnel had panicked. He had done his best under impossible circumstances. He would make them see. He would reclaim his story. 2 days later, the sound of a heavy transport helicopter ripped through the air. It was not a supply run. This was a command visit. A sleek, black-painted Seahawk landed, and from it emerged a figure that commanded immediate, absolute respect. Admiral Kincaid. He was the theater commander, a man whose reputation was built on a foundation of quiet, brutal competence. He was old school, a warrior philosopher who had seen everything, and his eyes missed nothing. He was accompanied by a team of investigators. The reckoning had arrived. The formal debriefing was held in the now fully restored command tent. The air was cold, the powerful air conditioners humming with renewed life. Admiral Kincaid sat at the head of the long conference table, flanked by his aides. Master Chief Sullivan was there, as was the young engineer officer, Davies, and a handful of other key personnel. Thorne, in a freshly pressed uniform, sat ramrod straight, a thick binder containing his prepared report in front of him. He had requested to speak first, a strategic move to frame the narrative. Vance was there too. She stood at the back of the room, near the same supply crates where she had first been accosted by Thorne. She was in clean, sterile fatigues, her hands clasped loosely behind her back. She held no binder, no notes, no data slate. She was simply present, a silent observer. She had been ordered to attend. Thorne began his presentation. He stood and walked to the main display, his old confidence returning as he fell back into the familiar rhythm of performance. He spoke for nearly an hour, his voice resonating with practiced sincerity and dramatic emphasis. He painted a picture of chaos, of cascading equipment failures, of a brave commander struggling against impossible odds. He used phrases like unprecedented electronic warfare signature and asymmetrical attack doctrine. He praised the courage of his men, subtly implying that their success was a result of the discipline he had instilled in them. He never mentioned Vance by name. He referred only to support elements and field expedient communications. He was rebuilding his bonfire, log by log, lie by lie. When he finished, he looked at Admiral Kincaid, his expression one of solemn, noble duty. The Admiral listened without interruption, his face an unreadable mask of granite. When Thorne was done, Kincaid did not thank him. He let the silence stretch, becoming heavy and uncomfortable. Then he turned his gaze to the back of the room. "Specialist Vance," he said, his voice quiet, yet carrying more authority than all of Thorne's booming declarations. "Your report." All eyes turned to her. Thorne smirked, a flicker of contempt. What could she possibly have to say? The little mouse had no report, no data, no understanding of the complexities he had just outlined. She would stammer, she would be intimidated, and his version of events would stand. Vance did not move from her spot. She did not speak. She simply raised her left hand, holding a small black data slate. She looked at Master Chief Sullivan. He nodded, and with a few keystrokes on his own console, patched her slate into the main display. The screen, which had been showing Thorne's impressive-looking but meaningless charts, went black. Then it split into 4 quadrants. The first quadrant showed a tactical map of the base, time-stamped to the exact moment the attack began. The second showed a scrolling log of all network activity. The third displayed a waveform analysis of all radio frequencies. The fourth was a simple audio visualizer. There was no commentary, no presentation, just the raw, immutable data. It began to play. The room was silent, save for the hum of the servers and the recording that now filled the space. They heard the initial electronic squeal and saw the network log fill with red lines of code as every system on the base flatlined. Then they heard Thorne's voice, raw and unfiltered from the command tent's own internal logs. "Report! What the hell was that? Get the backup generators online, now!" The voice was not commanding, it was panicked. The data stream was a cold, clinical vivisection of Thorne's failure. It showed his tactical orders to send teams to empty grid coordinates, overlaid on a map that, thanks to Vance's intercepted data, now showed the enemy's actual positions, moving unimpeded towards the fuel depot. They heard him yelling into a dead radio, his commands becoming more frantic, more desperate. They saw the network logs showing zero response from the systems he was trying to command. The data didn't just contradict his report, it annihilated it. It exposed his story not just as a lie, but as a pathetic fantasy. Thorne's face had gone pale. The blood drained from it, leaving a waxy gray sheen. His carefully constructed bonfire was being consumed by a flood of ice-cold truth. Then, the data stream shifted. A new icon appeared on the tactical map, a single blue marker labeled Medbay. It began to issue commands. Text logs appeared, showing Vance's precise, logical instructions to the power and comms teams. The audio switched to the new makeshift command net she had established. Her voice was calm, steady, a river of pure information in a sea of chaos. The tactical display showed the friendly forces who had been scattered and confused, now moving with a deadly, coordinated purpose, their movements perfectly countering the enemy's infiltration. They watched as she turned a near-certain disaster into a textbook example of asymmetrical defense. The final piece of data was the most damning. It was a decrypted audio file, an enemy communication Vance had plucked from the air with her jury-rigged antenna. A voice, speaking in Pashto, was clear. "The commander is a fool. He does exactly as the profile predicted. He is loud, predictable. He sends his men to chase ghosts. The depot is ours." There was a pause, then another voice. "The system is fighting back. It is not the commander. It is something else. It is quiet. It thinks. Fall back. The trap is not for us. It is for him." The recording ended. The screen went black. The silence in the room was absolute, a crushing weight. Thorne stood frozen, his mouth slightly agape, his eyes wide with the horror of total public exposure. He was a bug pinned to a board, dissected and displayed for all to see. He had been judged not by a human rival, but by the unblinking, unforgiving eye of the data itself. He was broken. The correction was complete. Admiral Kincaid let the silence hold for another 10 seconds, a small eternity. Then he spoke, his voice dangerously soft. "Lieutenant Commander Thorne, you are a disgrace to the uniform. Your performance was not just incompetent, it was an act of gross negligence that nearly cost the lives of every person on this base. You valued your ego above your duty. You are relieved of your post, effective immediately. You will be confined to quarters under guard, pending court-martial. Get him out of my sight." Two master-at-arms who had been standing by the door moved forward. They did not touch Thorne, but their presence was a cage. Thorne stumbled back to his seat, collapsing into it. He looked smaller, shrunken, his immaculate uniform now appearing like a costume on a failed actor. He was no longer a commander. He was just a man who had been weighed, measured, and found wanting. The debriefing was over. The investigators would handle the details. Admiral Kincaid stood, his gaze sweeping over the remaining personnel, and finally resting on Vance, who had not moved, her expression unchanged throughout the entire proceeding. She had simply presented the facts. The system had corrected itself. Later that day, the base had found a new equilibrium. The quiet hum of efficiency had returned, but it was different now. The ambient anxiety was gone, replaced by a quiet, focused confidence. The chain of command was being reestablished, but a new, unspoken hierarchy had been formed, one based not on rank, but on demonstrated competence. The name Vance was now spoken with a mixture of fear and profound respect. She was no longer the rookie nurse, she was an immutable law of nature. Vance was in the clinic, alone. The last of the wounded had been stabilized and prepped for transport. The chaos had subsided, leaving only the quiet, methodical work of cleaning and restocking. She disassembled a complex field surgical kit, wiping each instrument clean, sterilizing it, and placing it back in its designated slot. The rhythmic, repetitive task was a form of meditation for her, a way of resetting her own internal systems after the storm of the crisis. Her mind was already moving on, processing the engineering reports on the power grid, analyzing the weaknesses the attack had exposed, formulating countermeasures. The work was never done. The clinic door slid open with a soft hiss. Vance didn't look up, assuming it was Davies with a supply manifest, but there was no sound of footsteps, no voice. There was only a shift in the quality of the silence. She slowly raised her head. Framed in the doorway were 6 men. They were not soldiers or security personnel. They were something else entirely. They were large men, clad in sand-colored tactical gear, their faces hardened by sun and war, their bodies honed into instruments of lethal purpose. Their movements were utterly silent, their presence filling the small room with an almost physical pressure. Navy SEALs. They were the quick reaction force that had been scrambled during the attack, the ones who had followed her disembodied voice through the darkness, trusting her unseen guidance as they hunted down the last of the enemy infiltrators. They were the tip of the spear, the most elite warriors in the arsenal, and she had been their unseen commander. They filed into the room, their boots making no sound on the polished floor. They did not speak. They did not nod or smile. They formed a perfect straight line facing her, standing between the rows of medical cots. There was a beat of absolute stillness, a moment of profound unspoken communication. Then, as one, their bodies snapped to the rigid formal posture of perfect attention. Their heads were high, their eyes locked forward, their hands held flat at their sides. It was not a salute. It was something more. It was... A salute is a sign of respect for rank, for the uniform. This was different. This was the silent, absolute acknowledgement of the warrior for the master strategist. It was the reverence of the blade for the hand that wielded it. They were instruments of violence, and they were paying homage to the mind that had guided them with such lethal precision. In their world, the world of silent, competent lethality, this was the highest honor that could be bestowed. It was a vow of fealty, a recognition that in this quiet, unassuming woman, they had encountered a force superior to their own. Vance watched them, her face betraying no emotion, but her internal analysis registered the event. Input: unsolicited gesture of fealty from Tier 1 assets. Interpretation: acknowledgement of superior operational capability. Emotional component: irrelevant. System impact: establishes new informal command structure based on merit. She gave a single slow nod. It was not a dismissal, but an acceptance. Acknowledged. In the doorway, 2 more figures appeared, Admiral Kincaid and Master Chief Sullivan. They had been watching, silent witnesses to the ceremony. Sullivan had a rare, genuine smile on his weathered face. He had known from the beginning. He had seen the Bugatti in the bike rack. Admiral Kincaid stepped forward, his boots clicking softly on the floor. He stopped a few feet from Vance, his eyes, which had seen so much war and politics, were filled with a deep professional respect. He did not speak of the debriefing, or of Thorne, or of the battle. All of that was just noise, the messy byproduct of the real event. The real event was the emergence of a new kind of power, a new standard of excellence. He looked at this quiet woman, who wore no rank and sought no glory, who had saved them all not with a roar, but with a whisper of pure, cold logic. He, the commander of the entire theater of operations, a man with admirals and generals who answered to him, saw in her something that transcended the rigid hierarchy he represented. He saw the future. He saw what the institution, at its best, strove to be: perfectly competent, utterly professional, and ruthlessly effective. Slowly, deliberately, Admiral Kincaid raised his hand to his brow in a crisp, formal salute. It was the institution itself, in the form of one of its most powerful leaders, bowing to a higher authority. Not the authority of rank, but the immutable, undeniable authority of sheer, silent, soul-crushing competence. The bonfire was gone. The stone remained. And the legend of the quiet woman in the gray fatigues, the ghost who had saved FOB Ares, was no longer a whisper among the enlisted. It was now doctrine.